sometimes it takes that long to figure out what's important about a story. And you have to wade through what you're learning to find the themes and the focus, and that was the story with me. I started with one idea, and I came out with a very different one. I'll tell you briefly how I started on this, and then I'm going to read a talk.
Yeah.
And then I hope we'll have some questions. I got started on this when the director of John Brown Lives invited me to curate an exhibit. She'd moved within a year or so to Elizabethtown and had started this social justice organization and had just learned that John Brown lived in the Adirondacks, and what's more, came to the region of Black pioneers who were there, and she was so mind-boggled by this story, she thought, well, let's have an exhibit to explore more of it, and I was quite resistant. I said, I've read the histories on this, what little was written in the 19th century. Nothing happened. Very few people came. It was a renowned flop, and we'd have 2 panels. And she said, dig a little deeper and see what you find. And what I found was too abundant to put on the walls of an exhibition. That's what gave me the idea to do a short pamphlet on it, and that wasn't so short, and then it blossomed into the book that I'll be signing it back if you're interested. In other words, there's a great deal more there than I expected. One of the benefits about having done this book, or giving these talks, these lectures, is I never get bored, because every talk has to be a little different. Everywhere I speak, there's inevitably a local hook to this story, and they always introduce an intimate, fresh angle. When in 1846, the upstate New York land baron, Gerrit Smith, gave away 120,000 acres of his wild Adirondack land to 3,000 poor Black New Yorkers, he asked his designated land agents, 13 dedicated abolitionists, Black and white, to scour every county of the state for eligible grantees. He divided this group into 4 committees and assigned each committee to its own swath of New York and dispatched them to meet their quotas. Smith's long inventory of grantee deed holders at Cornell's Special Collections identifies not only every one of his 3,000 grantees, but tells us in what town and county they resided when they got land, and where their gift lots were, how big they were, and why sometimes they had to be replaced. And these links took me everywhere. To the grantee Moses Viney of Schenectady, a self-freed slave and coachman for the Union College president. To the newsman activist Willis Hodges of Brooklyn, who with a party of downstate grantees launched a colony called Blacksville. To the farm laborer Avery Hazard of Jackson, Washington County, who moved his large family to a new home in the Adirondack hamlet of St. Armand. About Clinton County's 3 grantees from respectively Chazy, thank you, Champlain and Clintonville, I discovered very little, but Lafayette Mason of New Russia, an Essex County grantee whose diasporic story I'll return to, claims several pages in my book, and his Clinton County roots ran deep. As did Gerrit Smith's affection for his several Clinton County abolitionist friends, who he names and celebrates in a long, schmoozy travel piece that ran in the anti-slavery Albany Patriot in 1845. Early anti-slavery conventions had brought these Clinton County activists to Smith's attention, and for years he backed their anti-slavery work with gifts for their anti-slavery libraries and funding for their local anti-slavery societies. I hear Peru actually had 3 of these. That's kind of extraordinary, isn't it? Undoubtedly, Smith hoped his interest would be rewarded with their support for his beloved Liberty Party, organized in 1840 specifically to fight slavery through political action at the polls. In 1845, Smith's travelogue in the Patriot tracked every leg of the journey he took with his wife and secretary, starting in Peterborough, Madison County, south of the Adirondack frontier to Albany, and then north to Saratoga and up into the Adirondack region and around it all the way back home. was inspired by his own business interests to do this. A trip like this could help him check up on his upstate rent collectors and contract farmers and size up present and prospective regional investments. But for the readers of The Patriot, an anti-slavery paper, Smith kept the business talk in check, emphasizing instead his widespread Adirondack abolitionist allies, from Keene's Phineas Norton, that ornament to our cause, to Wendell Lansing, newspaper publisher and Keysville's true friend of the slave, and Champlain's famous Noadiah Moore, that wise and steadfast friend of the slave, who traveled 20 miles from his home to hear Smith hold forth on abolition. And these contacts and their territory here would be recalled by Smith in the year to come and solace his dark mood in a rough time, and also give him the seed of an idea. But before I dig into Smith's scheme of justice and benevolence, as he called it, I want to review the legislation that provoked it, which was proposed at the Second New York Constitutional Convention of 1821, when delegates from all over the state gathered in Albany to debate and revise the rights of enfranchisement for the working poor. Before 1821, poor black New Yorkers, white or black, all could vote if they owned or could prove they owned $100 in landed property. Poverty was penalized, but the penalty itself was colorblind. In 1821, this changes. Delegates vote to jack up the property requirement for prospective black New Yorkers to $250. For poor white New Yorkers, the $100 requirement is canceled. And all at once, the law was racialized. Lacking the right to self-representation, impoverished black men, and most black New Yorkers were very poor indeed, were silenced. They couldn't vote for their ward bosses, for judges, for any candidate who stood for anti-slavery reform. The pro-slavery vote, on the other hand, now bolstered by the enfranchised working poor and immigrant ballots especially, got stronger. And no accident, any of this. In 1821, pro-slavery business interests were already worried about what was coming down the pike in 1827, when New York slavery was abolished. A new voting bloc that might expand the anti-slavery lobby posed a risk. Black anti-slavery votes would be bad for business and bad for the stability of North-South relations. The new property requirement of 1821 aimed to subvert and disable a prospective lobby before it ever had a chance to form. And it worked. Black justice and anti-slavery interests would have no political representation from black voters and would be silenced yet again in 1846 at the next Constitutional Convention, when the pro-slavery lobby defeated a bid to repeal this voter requirement for black men, except in the Adirondacks and points north. At the November polls in 1846, Clinton County went 5-1 in favor of equal suffrage. Essex Franklin backed racial justice too. Could there be a better, safer place in New York State for a black suffrage justice colony than this Yankee-settled Adirondack country up here, whose legacy of slavery was comparatively light, whose population was still thin, and still indebted to the imprint, the legal imprint and culture of New England? If not free from racist sentiment, far from it, at least this region was not defined by or beholden to the slaveocracy, which I think we could say about many other parts of New York. Obviously the downstate sector, but also Hudson River Valley and points west as well. And there were other reasons to favor this northern territory. Smith had inherited a massive land fortune, close to 750,000 acres from his father Peter, once a business partner for John Jacob Astor. He lived too far from his vast Adirondack property to manage it with care, and owning so much unused land did not square with his own equalitarian ideals. He had tried selling a good piece of it with only nominal success. He was sick of paying taxes on it. It was time to let it go. On August 1, 1846, Smith wrote to his black friends, quote, Since the state has determined that black men must become landholders that they may be entitled to vote, they will become landholders. Vote they will, cost what it will. His new land distribution plan for black New Yorkers would express a kind of environmental distributive justice. It would model interracial collaboration. It would exemplify affirmative action a century before this strategy was named. And while we don't think of land gifts in these terms, it implicitly extended the promise of affordable housing and food security on self-owned, self-worked land. And of course, it would facilitate black access to the ballot. As Smith wrote his black allies in Manhattan, I'm paraphrasing here, "I know poor white New Yorkers are just as badly off as black people, but white men can vote. Poor black men cannot. With these land gifts, I even out the playing field. I redress a racialized injustice." Were any of Smith's gift lots worth $250? $50 is more like it. That's high. But over a few years, with labor and improvements, a wild lot could gain this value. Sweat equity was part of Smith's idea too. He could have given bigger land lots or cash gifts that would enfranchise his grantees outright, but this missed the point. A bracing encounter with the rigors of the Adirondack wilderness, Smith wrote, would work out a far better character than if his grantees had an over-easy time of it, or as he put it, built their new homes on fat lands under genial suns. New York's northern frontier would be a proving ground for black manhood and worthiness for citizenship. As to identifying land-worthy giftees, that work fell, as I indicated before, to his land agents, who would ensure that all prospects for free land met Smith's terms of eligibility, namely no drinking, good character, poverty, and a New York address. And this they did over the course of 2 years' time, got 3,000 deeds into the hands of his many black grantees. Now you think you know what happened. Obviously, if 3,000 black New Yorkers colonized a swath of Franklin and Essex counties, you would have known about this, I think. With Gerrit Smith, along with Gerrit Smith, you believe it was a flop. I plan to challenge, or at least interrogate that judgment, but first, let's give his disavowal a closer look. Smith would claim that only about 50 grantees settled their wild land. My math identifies more like 250 people, but then I include women and children and undeeded pioneers who came just because they liked the sound of Smith's idea, and several presumed fugitives who found their way to the black enclaves from the slave lands, and freed people who accompanied their army friends, white and black, north to Gerrit Smith's gift land after the Civil War. And that gets me up to this 250, which beats 50 for sure, but the turnout is still wretcheding next to Smith's own expectations. His disappointment cannot surprise us, nor can the fact he swiftly pivoted to other much more forceful anti-slavery initiatives. He organized an anti-fugitive slave law convention in Cazenovia, a huge success, and he bankrolled outfits that were helping fugitives get north. He contributed to land companies, helping Eastern immigrants get to bloody Kansas, to homestead and fight the slave power at the polls. And quietly, he started writing banknotes for more militant and extra-legal anti-slavery work from his old friend, the one-time Adirondack pioneer John Brown. And through all of this until 1857, Smith kept mum about his unmet expectations for his Adirondack misadventure. But when the great news editor Horace Greeley invited him to share his thoughts on what the heck went wrong up there, Smith comes clean. Maybe, he muses, I should have parceled out land that was easier to farm, you think? But then in a column that ran in Whig newspapers all over the country, he offered this: white men who live there in the Adirondacks can support their families by very hard work and very frugal habits. Why then, considering the character of the colored people, should we expect them to do much in such a country? This racialized indictment of his own grantees, faulting them for some essential lack of capacity, of character, of will, would feed historians and Adirondacophiles the analysis they needed to dismiss the giveaway and its recipients for another 150 years. An utter failure. The children of the sunny South could not tame the northern wilderness, declared one regional historian in 1877, and from Alfred Donaldson, 1921, the attempt to combine an escaped slave with a so-called Adirondack farm was about as promising of agricultural results as would be the placing of an Italian lizard on a Norwegian iceberg. Black historians, lacking access to archival sources, took these racialized judgments for fact and also dismissed Smith's failure. W.E.B. Du Bois's John Brown biography ignores it completely. Du Bois's disciple, Max Barber, the Philadelphia-based founder of the All-Black John Memorial Association, which led pilgrimages to Brown's home from 1922 into the 1970s, never once acknowledged the black farm colony that had inspired the white farmer John Brown to move to Essex County, never mind the black pioneers concerned with suffrage justice and black rights. Burnishing Gerrit Smith's indictment into a fable of black unfitness for Adirondack life, early historians and John Brown's biographers marginalized this episode into near oblivion. They did not, however, banish it outright. In the Adirondack narrative, which like every regional narrative, takes up the question of belonging, the story of the black pioneers was very useful. And in the last third of the 19th century, when immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and the black refugees from the Deep South were thronging northeastern cities, and Anglo-centric Northerners read this mounting wave of newcomers as an existential threat to American identity, Adirondack histories that furnished a cautionary tale about manifest unfitness for the wilderness hit a mark. These black pioneers who came and vanished were in their way exemplary. There were people who belonged inside the blue line, there were people who did not. What happened to the black pioneers in regional histories would also be the literary fate of indigenous people, francophones, Southern and Eastern European laborers, peddlers, hobos, gypsies, and migratory work crews who weren't and never could be real Adirondackers. Their stories would go missing. Mostly, they still are. Smith got one thing right, however. His expectations were mistaken, but he hadn't overestimated his grantees. The grantees were not the problem. He hadn't done his homework. He had underestimated grievously the depth of black impoverishment. Agricultural historians reckon that in these antebellum decades, only pioneers who set out with $1,500 in startup money could hope for some success. Those who couldn't underwrite their first years, the hardest years, gave up and went home. The fact was, for the majority of Smith's grantees, the move he hoped to launch was simply unaffordable. The journalist and orator Frederick Douglass, initially an ardent promoter of the giveaway, grasped this fatal problem early on and called it out in his newspaper in January 1949. Either these settlers had to get the money they needed to make it, or this project will collapse, he wrote. But the grantees knew it from the first. A paper deed might get them to this land. It couldn't buy a team of horses. It couldn't purchase tools and seed and nails. It couldn't launch an Adirondack farm. Indeed, the very poverty that made so many of his grantees eligible for free land in the first place made them loath to claim it. They knew their capacity, and they held back. In addition to not recognizing the desperate need for startup capitalization, Smith also failed to anticipate how the settlers would be received. Would they be welcomed or reviled? In his report on his visit to the Giftlands in the fall of 1847, the Syracuse land agent, Reverend Jermaine Logan, described dishonest guides who took credulous grantees to lousy lots, then coaxed them to sell their deeds for pennies. Pick your white friends with care, Logan cautioned, and named 9 white Adirondackers in as many towns the homesteaders could trust. Warming news, this, as was the very good account Logan gave about the land and how many pioneers were actually progressing. But why so late arriving? And why had Smith not supplied his agents with the names of these white allies in the region long before, or anticipated resistance from those Adirondack farmers who might well have wondered why Smith gave free land to city strangers when they liked to farm, knew how to farm, and had proven their devotion to Adirondack farming over years and sometimes decades. Smith was, after all, the contract holder for many hundreds of them. Were they not also worthy of a break? These oversights hint at the philanthropist's distractedness, but Smith cannot be faulted for failing to anticipate the impact of the fugitive slave law on the progress of his initiative. We can't know how many grantees might have come and didn't because they worried about bounty-seeking white Adirondackers whose predatory vigilance the new law now rewarded. We do know of several grantees, once enslaved, who were inspired by the new law, or driven by the new law, rather, to move to Canada, not to their gift land. No security in these unfamiliar woods. But now let's look at what went right. Gains the settlers experienced on this frontier, Smith never knew about and probably couldn't because the stories hide in archival records not publicly accessible until the late 20th century. But we can read these, and from them, not from Smith's dashed expectations, we can learn the impact of 250 black Adirondackers on an underpopulated frontier. Black and white North Elbans founded 2 North Elba churches together, a cemetery, a library, and a choir. They shared town appointments, fire watcher, fence viewer, constable, inspector of elections. Black and white homesteaders brought their potatoes to the same starch factory, buried their dead in the same rural cemeteries, went to church together, and sent their children to the same drafty schools. Mountain hikes, ball games, Christmas feasts, and field work were shared pursuits. In Bloomingdale, white neighbors stood by an elderly grantee when a Clinton County speculator tried to make him leave his farm. And in Franklin, white neighbors of a black farmer, once enslaved, talked a bounty hunter looking to kidnap John Thomas and return him to his enslaver into giving up and going away. Not only is he armed and ready for you, the interloper was advised, if you go after him, we'll take his side. This is in county history, and the historian pointed out that he corroborated this with interviews with 3 sets of witnesses. In St. Armand, Franklin, and North Elba, where most of the black settlers lived, black men gained the vote, and early on. Some may have owned $250 in real property, but many, I would bet, did not. John Brown's good friend Lyman Epps was a faithful voter. His son Lyon Jr. never missed an election in his life, and Willis Hodges, up in the enclave he called Blacksville, was so hot to vote on his arrival, John Brown urged him to please slow down. Tax records in the state archives reveal black farmers in Franklin bearing witness to their white neighbors' farm improvements, crucial testimony for a farmer hoping to redeem his property from confiscation for unpaid taxes. And white farmers did the same for the black pioneers. And no mention of race in these prolific affidavits, none at all. During the Civil War, black men, young and aging from the Black Woods, stepped up to serve, and after the Civil War, when black veterans tapped their white neighbors to support their appeals for military pensions for war-incurred injuries, their white friends turned out for them in force with letter after letter, and none of this Smith knew. Nor would he learn how his land giveaway enabled abiding affection among the families of war veterans, black and white, evidenced in these Civil War pension files. In the National Archives, these affidavits from white Adirondack veterans and their wives express deep concern with pension justice for black veterans and a stake in its success. Wrote the white farmer Sylvester Reed to the Pension Bureau about his black neighbor. He was a St. Armand guy. Civil War veteran in 1891, quote, "We are farmers, so is Charles H. Hazard. He has employed us, so have we him, on our farms." And Reed, not the Pension Bureau, knew for a fact that when Hazard was working in his field, on his farm, he could be so convulsed with pain he had to be carried home. Quote, "I knew her when she was a small girl," said Eunice Swinier of the war widow Charlotte Morehouse. "I knew her at the time of her marriage to Stephen W. Morehouse, and know she has never been married before and has not been married since he died. She has always lived within a few rods of me, and if she married, I should have known it." Eunice also knew all of Charlotte's children's birthdays, their middle names, and when Henry first had fits and was seized by paralysis. Who told her this? No one told her. She was there. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not arguing, as some folks have, for some higher post-racial utopia on the Adirondack frontier. Evidence of racism abided, and the white authors of affidavits may have shared these biases themselves. What white neighbors were defending was not racial justice, but the right to their own experience, their ownership of their own memory, their place-based knowledge. Did a pension examiner in Plattsburgh insist that Private Hazard was just fine? Well, that surgeon didn't know the man, didn't know his history, didn't have a clue. The grantees not only integrated this frontier and enabled the emergence of a notable, if imperfect, equalitarian social culture, they challenged Smith's conception of the giveaway, and in crucial ways, they improved it. Did Smith and his friend, the radical black minister from Troy, Henry Highland Garnett, a land agent, anticipate, quote, "a perfect system of agrarianism in the Adirondack woods"? A very bad idea. And very quickly, the grantees, like their white neighbors, diversified their husbandry with guiding, logging, trapping, hiring out for day work, finding work in the new hunters' lodges and country inns. In the great commons of the unregulated wilderness, black people and white hunted, fished, and foraged together, and bridled at new laws that deemed them poachers and their culture of subsistence something thieving and pathetic. The shared work of placemaking in a hard new place was no perfect antidote for racism, but racism was challenged and subverted in 100 unsuspected ways. Smith also assumed the grantees would settle on their gift lots, but very few of these were actually occupied. The grantees scouted, almost all of them, for better land and planted their new homes on these lots instead. Several opted to buy land from Smith, and not always in the gift land. One of the very few native Adirondackers in Smith's roster of grantees was the Collier woodsman Lafayette Mason, born enslaved in Clinton County. Mason had moved from Clinton County to Essex County and settled in New Russia when he was made a Smith grantee. But he wasn't tempted to move to Franklin County. He had a good thing going where he was. New Russia, in the long settled stretch of eastern Essex County along Lake Champlain, was ablaze with kilns, sawmills, furnaces, and forges. Work crews and their bosses needed milk, charcoal, venison, and eggs that Mason could provide. This subsistence farmer had a sugar bush. A rum distillery would buy his syrup. He knew where to drop a line. The fresh-caught fish he brought to Hiram Putnam's store got him tobacco, flour, and seed. This thanks to the researcher Maggie Bartley, who discovers this in the remains of that store, an old ledger that details these exchanges. On every side, the prospects rose like cream for him, and with them his ambition. In 1860, Mason put $100 down on a 351-acre wooded lot in Roaring Brook Tract, where he and his young family were already raising wheat, oat, corn, turnips, and potatoes, and tending milk cows, chickens, and a pig. Garrett Smith, the seller, gave Mason 10 years to pay a $600 balance in annual installments. Then, I guess I've got it here. Then, and here I'll read a bit from my book. Then the long shells found Fort Sumter, and Mr. Lincoln asked for men. A few weeks shy of Christmas in 1863, Mason's 14-year-old son, Louis, left New Russia for Brooklyn to join the 20th Volunteers U.S. Colored Troops. Lafayette Mason, who was light enough to pass for white, earned a $350 bounty when he joined a local company of the 118th Infantry Regiment, which was white. Private Mason, the elder, fought at Petersburg, Richmond, and Fair Oaks. At the last of these, in late 1864, he was taken prisoner with 600 Union troops. It is likely Mason counted himself lucky. Union casualties at Fair Oaks were 1,600, and Confederates fewer than 100. But Mason, once a man of iron constitution, according to his doctor, emerged from the long hell of a prisoner of war camp or ruin, or as his doctor put it, a skeleton of his former self. Reunited with his family in New Russia in 1865, Louis, back at home as well, was still recovering from dysentery and a racking cough. Mason tried to pick up where he'd left off, but with his soldier's bounty and his contract payments in arrears, he could not keep pace. A year after his and Louis's return from the front, Mason's land contract was annulled. Gerrit Smith sold Mason's contract to a secretary's niece in New York City. The abolitionist who had given a black pioneer free land in the name of political empowerment and economic freedom bowed to the speculator landlord who yanked a farm contract from a war-disabled, late-paying veteran and father of 14 and sold it to a white, long-distance city buyer with no intent to settle. And from Gerrit Smith's perspective, this made sense. A deal was a deal. Mason had not honored it. He would have to pay the price. At wit's end, the black contract farmer took Gerrit Smith to court, a desperate move. His case was obviously hopeless. He had paid nothing to his leaseholder beyond the first deposit. Not only was his plea dismissed, he now faced court costs and eviction. In 1866, the unhoused Masons moved to Iowa, farming in Vernon Springs and Steamboat Rock. Then, in 1877, Lafayette and Mary pushed west to Minnehaha County in the New Dakota Territory and claimed a 160-acre plot under the Civil War Homestead Act. Their new frame house measured 12 by 14 feet. When Lafayette died in 1879, he and Mary had broken 18 acres and planted 400 fruit trees. And here the widow stayed, tending her young orchard, keeping faith with the old self-providing agrarian idea until her failing health forced her to join her son Louis, now a janitor and deacon for his Minneapolis church. No farming for him. It scans like a tragedy, but this isn't how I see it. The grantee private Mason stayed stoutly faithful to his dream of his own self-sufficient farm, the great Republican idea, long after Gerrit Smith lost interest, as would several other grantee settlers who left the giftlands for better farm prospects in Malone, the Mohawk Valley, and Vermont. And Mason also used his gift deed to help him access the vote, as did, I learned, many hundreds of black New Yorkers who, unbeknownst to Smith, retained their gift deeds for the good they did on election days until 1870, the year the 15th Amendment enfranchised all men without regard for race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Smith's dream was dreamt and realized over and again, and he never had a clue. But we know. And if the man's patience and loyalty to his own idea fell short of his vision, the vision nonetheless continues to inspire, provoking not just my own work on this book, but several new historic markers in the Adirondack Park marking chapters of this story, a brook newly named for John Thomas, the escaped slave who was a Smith grantee, considerable new genealogical research, much of it housed at the Underground History Museum, I think, a 13-year-old archaeological dig at a grantee's gift lot, modern dance pieces, a jazz concert, a children's play, a great novel by Russell Banks, several documentaries, a full-bore oratorio, and a permanent exhibition at the John Brown Farm, which commemorates the giveaway. And all this in the last quarter century. just imagine what the next half century might bring. Thank you.